Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation that I give on behalf of my colleague Andrew Howe of the University of Minnesota Morris. And we together worked on a paper that we entitled A Disillusion with the Olympic Fantasy, Olympic Identity Card Related Controversies in the Cold War. You might have heard of the Olympic Identity Card, which I will abbreviate as OIC, which is often seen as a very simple credential, but its role in Olympic history actually reveals a very complex intersection of politics, of law, and also of the IOC's idealism. It's rarely studied, but it raises critical issues, and particularly about security, functionality, validity, and practicality, issues that become very visible when global political diplomacy clashed with Olympic ambitions. And this is what I'm going to explore in this presentation. So, how the OIC evolved from a basic ID, essentially, to a symbol of the Olympic movement's supranational hopes, but also its political limitations. And as the presentation title said, my examples will mainly be from the Cold War period. That's because Andrew is obviously an expert on China and the Olympic movement, and this plays into this presentation, whereas I recently have published a paper on the history of the IOC Medical Commission. As I said, very few studies actually look into the OIC, and the OIC had rarely, if not ever, been the focus of research. So, at the start, we will take a quick look at its development and the history of the modern Olympic movement, because it's simple, but not so simple, and that makes it a very fascinating subject in itself. Justin Margolis, he explained the early history of the OIC while discussing the idea of an Olympic passport for asylum-seeking Olympians. Um, and we draw a little bit on his findings. Back in 1912, the Swedish Olympic Committee issued identification cards for athletes and officials so that the Swedish Railway could offer discounted fares and also waived fees to the participating Olympians at the time. Um, 12 years later, in Paris, they expanded the parties involved in the issuance of these cards. And the French Foreign Ministry worked together with the organizing committee at the time, not only to extend the travel benefits, but also to have actually the OIC play the role of a passport when it came to traveling within France. Important, please note that the functionality expansion did not cover international travel, as visa was still issued to foreign athletes. And actually, at that time, these booklet-style passports that we still know had just been introduced. We do not really know if it was an effort to one up the French, but the Dutch foreign minister permitted the use of the OICs to enter the Netherlands for the 1928 Olympic Games. And that actually officially turned the OIC into an international travel document. The same procedure was applied for the Winter Games in Switzerland. So in the decades that followed, in the 30s, but then particularly also in the 1950s, an Olympian could choose to use that OIC Olympic document as an international travel document if their own government allowed it and endorsed or certified the OIC as such a travel document. But of course, as you can imagine, the implementation was not without challenges or inconveniences. In many cases, unless one traveled by air directly to the host city of the Games, transit countries might not recognize the OIC, which would require the traveler to carry a normal passport as well. Generally speaking, however, the IOC did not exempt a visa requirement without the exception of the 1952 Olympic Games in Helsinki and the equestrian events held in Stockholm in Sweden in 1956 for the Melbourne Olympics. But visa fees were generally waived. By 1968, the recipients of the OIC included athletes, coaches, officials, IOC, and also international federation staff, media, and special guests of the organizing committee. Um, there was not a pronounced conflict during this time, but we already do see a gap between the reality and the ideal here. Because when it comes to the free flow and the admission of the Olympians, the IOC obviously wanted to adopt a supranational, above politics approach, which we know, of course, was the IOC's rhetoric and policy at the time. But the IOC must yield, of course, to the different requirements and preferences in the countries which were considered to be sovereign political matters. For example, 30 of the 59 participating countries opted to accept the OIC as a travel document for their Olympians for the 1948 Olympics. And for Helsinki, that was 32 out of 69. We're emphasizing the visa requirement because until 1975, the Olympic Charter did not mention the Olympic identity cards of the OICs at all. But as soon as they were included, the Charter clearly stated that the OIC, quote, establishes the identity of its holder and constitutes a document replacing a visa, allowing entry into the country in which the city organizing the game is situated, end quote. This is important because from the 1920s to the 1960s, the main issue was whether the OICs could be treated like passports. As I said earlier, the French and the Dutch were the first to really question this, opening a kind of Pandora's box. Occasionally, host countries decided on their own to allow visa-free entry for OIC holders. But what changed in the years before 1975 that led the IOC to officially require its own rules, as is stated in this charter change. And that leads me to look a little bit into the case or an OIC related crisis around the Munich Olympic Games in 1972 that had at its consequence the change of the Olympic Charter. In 1964, Southern Rhodesia declared independence from the British Crown under a white minority government. We know this. This sparked a civil war between the Rhodesian regime and two African majority liberation movements, which were supported by the Eastern Bloc. But the international community did not recognize the country's independence. So Southern Rhodesia was still legally considered a British colony until 1980 when Zimbabwe was officially founded. In 1965, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 216, calling on all UN members not to recognize the minority regime in Rhodesia. And 3 years later, in 68, they went even further by banning the recognition of Southern Rhodesian passports and flags. This is important because just before Rhodesia's 64 declaration, the IOC, African support leaders, and Rhodesian representatives had reached the so-called Luxembourg Agreement, which allowed Rhodesian athletes to participate in the 1964 Games. IOC President Brundage insisted on inviting Rhodesia also to this 1968 Mexico City Games, but the Mexican government refused them entry on demand of the British government. All of this background is really important because West Germany was not yet a member of the UN and was not legally bound to those revolutions. But it was about to apply for UN membership at the time. So for the duration of the Munich Olympic Games, the German authorities actually decided to give priority to the Olympic Charter over political pressures. And in March 1972, the West German Ministry of the Interior issued a special regulation allowing Olympic identity cards to function as just travel documents, replacing passports and visas. And that actually allowed Southern Rhodesian athletes to enter West Germany using their OICs. Obviously, the controversy didn't end there. A group of 21 African countries threatened to boycott the Munich Games if Rhodesian athletes were allowed to compete. Their objections were based on Rhodesia's discriminatory policies in sport, but also society at large. And one of the central issues debated was whether an OIC could serve as a valid proof of nationality. The OICs issued to the Rhodesian athletes listed them as British subjects, but there was a claim by Soviet IOC member Adrianov that the original OICs only said Rhodesia, and that British subject was actually only added after the athletes passed through Spain or Portugal. Brundage had obviously hoped that the OICs would be enough and that the 1964 Luxembourg Agreement could somehow be arrived. But this was strongly opposed by African IOC members, and they argued that only passport should be used to establish nationality and not OICs, hence the quote on this slide. In the end, that debate didn't matter much. The African countries were firm in their threat to boycott the games. Southern Rhodesia should not participate, and the IOC obviously voted to withdraw the invitation for Rhodesian athletes to compete in 1972. So we can see here that the OSC raised serious questions about security, such as the risk of falsification, also about functionality. Is it a passport? Is it a visa? Is it both or neither? Is it valid at times, or only if a country choose to accept it? And its overall validity was really uncertain as well. And its practicality, of course, was further limited by the fact that host countries retained full sovereignty and could decide whether to accept it or not, as we'll see in a couple of cases now. In 1976, another issue arises. Montreal obviously had won the bid to host the games, and part of the deal that was that the Canadian government would invite and accept all athletes of all IOC affiliated NOCs, including that of Taiwan. The Canadian government actually revoked the Olympic identity cards that they had issued to the Taiwanese participants, citing the counter signature and residence was from the Republic of China, which it did not recognize, and wouldn't reinstate them until Taiwan agreed to compete with a different name, flag, and anthem. Twist happened here. Several Taiwanese athletes actually chose to bypass the OIC, the product of the IOC's supranational ambition, and entered Canada with the US or British Hong Kong passports that they held. So now the OICs became a double-edged sword for the IOC. They could simply choose to let them march and compete as it was, but that meant accepting the severe limitation of the OICs. Indeed, there were very few Taiwanese athletes exactly entered Canada, regardless of the political controversy in circumventing the scene. So more face laps when the idea of Olympic territory was floated. Realpolitik was real, and the Olympic ideal was and remained an illusion. So this case again exposed the four fundamental problems with the OICs. Security was challenged when Canada revoked the OICs. Functionality was questioned because they were supposed to act as a visa, but failed when political circumstances changed. Validity came under fire since Canada rejected the OICs entirely, and practicality was laid bare when Canadian sovereignty overrode the Olympic ideals. Just a quick follow-up on later. While the revisions of the Olympic Charter, so in 1975, did away with the language of replacing a visa in a vague way, they still mentioned, quote, that this card establishes the identity of its holder and constitutes the document allowing entry into the country in which the city organizing the game is situated. It was generally believed that the OIC could serve as a visa. But before President Carter publicly initiated the carnage that was the Moscow Games boycott, he demanded that Olympians obtain a visa despite the issuance of an OIC. For the LA Games, it's important to see what happened in the Baden-Baden Olympic Congress. Überroth, the president of the organizing committee of LA, argued that the guarantees required by the Olympic Charter concerning the use of the Olympic identity cards as visas had been requested from the United States government, and they really hoped that there would be a positive reply in the future. There was general concerns regarding the acceptance of the OIC, and the Olympic idealism is represented. Um, So the bouts between Olympic idealism and realpolitik ended in the former's concession. Not only did the IOC had to negotiate with host countries, but it also had to face the reality that the pursuit of these ideals often meant ignoring, if not is enabling human right evaluations. The OIC symbolized an Olympic communicus, but it did not seem that the world was ready at the time. So, in conclusion, the story of the OIC is ultimately a story of Olympic idealism meeting political reality, intended as a supranational tool for facilitating global athletic participation. It collided constantly with the four core issues of security, functionality, validity, and practicality. Thank you very much for your attention.